Welcome back to Women's Wealth, The Middle Way, the show that answers your questions about work, money, and family. My name is Susan McGlory Michael, and I am the CEO and founder of Glen Eagle, a wealth management firm in New Jersey.
My name's Carol Ann Fernandez. I'm the COO of Glen Eagle, and I'm really excited today to talk to our guest, Elizabeth Bachman, an expert who helps leaders speak with authority and impact. She's joining us today to share some powerful strategies that she's worked with women on to help them communicate with confidence and command the respect that they deserve, which I know we could all use. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Maybe you could just start by sharing with our listeners a little bit about your background and what even got you into working with women on communication.
Well, I think I've been dedicated to the art of great communication since I first walked on stage at the age of 5. And I heard my mom tell one of her friends that I was the best bunny rabbit ever to grace the stage of the Hillside School. And I thought, oh, they like me. I'll do that. And I thought I was going to be an actress, background in theater, went off to college and discovered that I was a better director than I was an actor. I'm an oldest child, so I like to tell people what to do. With a parallel interest in languages, and after lots of backing and forthing, wound up in opera, working my way up through the ranks from driving the truck and being 50% of the staff of a small touring company to directing at the Metropolitan Opera and around the world, ultimately to running my own opera company. So what I do now combines all the things I learned from founding and running an opera company, working internationally, directing, and having taught opera singers how to present themselves, and then learning that I had to do that for me in order to get people to fund my company. So it all comes together now with what I'm doing.
Yeah, it sounds like you've been an entrepreneur since the beginning. So congratulations. That is not an easy road.
Just happened that way, yes.
So what patterns do you see that are often holding, particularly women, since that's what we're talking about, back from reaching their goals or showing that confidence?
Let me try to give you the short version because it's a long conversation. I talk about this a lot, so if anybody's curious about what I say, check up with me on LinkedIn and I can explain more. But one of the things that I started noticing is the difference between men's language and women's language, and the way boys are taught to think and see the world and the way girls are taught. I started noting this early on in my opera career because as a director, I was one of the early women. It was always like, oh, and how do you see the story of Carmen from a female viewpoint? I would talk about that. Where it came to play is that when I wanted to run an opera company, I knew I would be good at running an opera company. Over the course of 3 years, I applied over and over again. And over again, I was number 2 or number 3 on the list, but they always gave the job to a man. Some of that was bias, but some of that, I realized later, now that I'm doing what I do now, I realized was how I had sabotaged myself over and over. And there were all these assumptions that girls are taught. We're socialized. I don't think anyone actually teaches us. I think we are socialized to don't brag, be nice, don't ask for money. That's something, if I could go back and change, I wish I had learned how to ask for money early because that held me back for years. What I mostly do now is help women step forward. Basically, you can shift the way you are perceived by shifting the way you communicate. That's what I do in the Visible and Valued programs, mostly to help people not make the same mistakes I did. I had to start my own company because no one would give me a company to run because I wasn't marketing myself right.
That's so interesting. We see this being in the finance world a lot of women lacking getting money for their company. So it's interesting how you're saying to some extent it might be the way that we're communicating or just not asking for it, which you don't hear often. So that's so interesting to hear in a way of thinking. I guess to dig into that a little bit more, what are some strategies that you use to help women change that? Because we do grow up in a certain way, right? And we learn from
Yeah.
society, I guess, not to. I know we only have so much time, but maybe just a few either phrases or strategies that you use when you're teaching women to counter what they've grown up doing.
Well, the first thing is to realize who are you talking to, and then talk to them in a language that they understand. So if you have a single focused person, which is traditionally men, historically men, but not always, there are a lot of single focused women, and you are the kind of person who likes to tell the whole story and start from how it all began and context and details, the single focused thinkers cannot take that in. They focus on one thing at a time. And this is why women will try to speak to men and they think the men don't listen, but because they've spoken to the men the way another woman would listen. Women traditionally tend to be multi-focused thinkers, but that's not always. It's just that's a stereotype where women will talk about 5 different things at once, and we can keep 5 things in our head at once. And we can mention something and the other person will pick it up and know they have to do something about it. You can't do that with a single focused thinker. And so I think this is why bullet points were invented. You want to give them just the basics and resist the temptation to give too much context, because until they understand why it matters, they're not going to care about the context, because basically they can't keep too many things in their head at once. That's a very short version of a 6-month program that I teach.
Yeah, no, I mean, you could see how this gets very powerful very fast, even just thinking business on the one hand, but I'm sure just relationships in general.
I actually learned it from a relationship coach. And we were talking and I said, well, this happens in business. And oh, wow, now I see why I didn't get it before. I was trying to speak like a woman to a man who got lost. And the thing is, if they get confused, they just tune you out. And then the woman gets mad and the guy goes, what? Why? What did I do? So that's one. And one other very useful hint that I learned, unfortunately, the hard way was women are taught to hint instead of ask. Asking is scary. Boys are taught to ask. Girls are taught, oh, it's scary to ask. They might say no. They might be mad at you. You've got to be nice. Don't be greedy. That was my mom's thing. Yeah, don't be greedy. Good girls don't brag. So I would hint, gee, it would be great if such and such happened. Gee, I'd love to have this project. Would you assign me to this project? I have great ideas for this. And if I didn't actually go out and say, I would like to be the person who runs this project and actually get their attention, I would be ignored. And I see this with my clients all the time where they come to me and they said, I was passed over for that promotion and they must hate me. And then we talk about it and I said, did you actually ask? And they went, well, they knew I wanted it. I said, did they really? As if the single focused thinkers speak Spanish and the multi-focused thinkers speak Italian. And if you're trying to speak Italian to a Spaniard, they will understand basics of what you say because the languages are very similar, but it's actually 2 different languages. And as long as we recognize that this is 2 different languages, then you can do something about it. And that's the shifting the way you're perceived. It starts with who's listening and how do they think? What's going to make sense to them? How can you get them to realize that this is for them? This is important to them.
Wow, that's so interesting. I know we could talk about this forever. I think every one of our listeners, I'm sure I know myself, are just even in this conversation thinking of different times that we already could adjust how we talk to someone now, thinking of the different languages. That's such a great way of putting it. But I guess
some practice, but
yeah, I'm sure it takes a lot of practice to change, especially after doing it for so long.
There's a whole process I help my clients go through about how do you notice? How do you notice what you're doing first? How do you notice what other people are doing first? And then you can start to change things. And I have one wonderful woman who is a project manager for an aerospace company. And they can't hear her. They don't pay attention to her. And she started saying, whenever she suggested something in a meeting, she said, and this is why. The reason this matters is, here's why we should think about this. And after 2 weeks, she called me up and she said, they're listening, actually asking for my advice. They never did that before.
Wow, that's amazing. Just by changing the way she was saying it.
2 weeks into the coaching. Yeah.
That's great. I guess we don't have too much time, unfortunately. I would love to continue to dig in so much more. But just to wrap up, what advice would you give? You've given so much advice already, but give to maybe someone who's listening who has a great idea, but they're just struggling with even how to go about getting that across. Like, what are some steps maybe they should take or try to look into?
The first thing I would say is figure out who's the decision maker and what do they care about. How can you phrase this in a way that they will understand why it matters? And the second thing I would say is connect with somebody, actually get some help. Talk it over with someone who can help you refine your pitch. It will make sense to the person who's listening. It's all about who's listening. I think of it as strategic empathy. Put yourself in the shoes of your listeners. What do they care about? And then start with the end and work your way backwards in terms of how to propose your idea.
I think that's so great and so hard to do sometimes. I think we go internal instead of external of thinking about who we're talking to. But I can't thank you enough, Elizabeth, for joining us today and just in this brief time giving us so much to think about. I know a number of our listeners will probably be reaching out to you just based on this conversation. So thank you again for taking the time.
My pleasure. I'm honored, and I'm really honored that what you're doing, the women's wealth and the middle way, that's so useful. I wish you'd been around in my 20s or even my 30s. I really needed you then. So thank you.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of Women's Wealth, The Middle Way. Make sure to subscribe to us and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. Join us for new episodes every other Wednesday. See you in 2 weeks.